you forcing this choice on me? I'm not a strong man. At one time I was strong, but not now. The future has made me afraid. I'm not a bad man. I've done my duty according to my rights.
Oh, you say a good prayer. Many's a time in the meeting house your prayer was like water in the desert to me.
Well, then I tried. Won't you be reasonable? What is it you want?
I want someone to help me not to move out of this house.
How are you going to find such a person?
I don't know. I don't know.
Mrs. Scott, they're burning down the houses. Do you understand that? Burning them down.
I think you should go home to your wife and children, Mr. Mackay.
Crichton Smith uses two main techniques to organise the novel. First, he builds Mrs. Scott's story around a series of visits. We have these head-to-head conversations between Mrs. Scott and other characters in the novel. It's a series of small scenes, like a play rather than a novel. Why does Crichton Smith use this approach? In the first place, it's to create a sense of sympathy for Mrs. Scott. The text follows only her. There are no lengthy conversations between other characters. The author commits us to the events affecting Mrs. Scott. We do feel sympathy for her, at least at the start. She is courteous, polite, in contrast to the rudeness of Seller. She is fairly passive as well in these conversations. Look at how little she says in each of the visits. She is confused, seeking answers, looking for reassurance. She asks questions. No satisfactory answers are given. The other reason for the visits is that Crichton Smith uses them to engage us, the readers, in the same quest for truth as Mrs. Scott. He allows each of the other characters to speak at length. They don't realise it, but they're revealing their motives, showing their true nature. The more they try to explain things away, the more they reveal their flaws, their weakness, their selfishness. You've got to discover what is true from all the web of gossip, rumour, lies, deception, hypocrisy and false promises we get from those who speak at Mrs. Scott. The elder is a weak man whose needs overcome his moral and religious beliefs. The minister, without even knowing it, reveals himself as a superior, hypocritical self-seeker, out of touch with the congregation he's supposed to serve. As for Seller and Loch, what are they like? A version of the good cop, bad cop routine. Donald MacLeod's the only one who comes out of it well. He is the one who shows honesty and a kind of moral strength. He's genuinely concerned for Mrs. Scott, and his writing about the evictions is his way of pursuing truth and justice. Crichton Smith uses a second tactic to organise the novel. These are time shifts or flashbacks. In the first part of the novel, the action shifts between present and past. Each chapter where Mrs. Scott tries to make sense of what is going to happen to her is followed by one where she recalls a key episode from her past. Seller visits. When he leaves, she thinks about her mother, her marriage, about death. The elder visits. When he leaves, she remembers Ian as a boy. And after her visit to the minister, there's a memory of Ian leaving Scotland and leaving her. In these key episodes, or flashbacks, we see a different side to Mrs. Scott, most notably in the way she treats her son.
You shouldn't have gone. You had no right. How would you like it if people were spying on you?
I heard a boy followed her to Glasgow and that she flirted with everybody she met.
That's a lie.
If you don't believe me, go and ask your aunt.
I don't know my aunt, and I don't believe her.
Have you ever known me to tell a lie?
Anyway, I might get somebody worse than her.
You might get somebody from the village, but you're too young. I was 29 years old when I got married. You got plenty of time for that sort of thing.
What would you say if I emigrated?
What did you say?
Other boys have emigrated. I might get a better wife if I went to Canada.
Go out with Elizabeth then. I'm not stopping you.
Who said I wanted to go out with her? Aren't you saying she's a flirt?
Where are you going?
Out.
I'm only trying to protect you. How would you feel if you found out she was a flirt after getting serious with her?
Oh, I know you're only trying to help.
Oh, do what you like. I won't say any more about it.
You may have said too much. So the two of you had a good gossip, and that was the end of Elizabeth. Anyway, you can be sure I won't bring any girls back to this house.
I never asked you not to do that.
I'm doing it just the same. I don't want you to be setting off to find out what your spies have to say about them. They'd find things to say about God himself.
In these flashbacks, Mrs. Scott comes across as a more complex, more troubled character than we'd first thought. Like us, this 70-year-old woman is a product of her past, of her experiences, of her relationships. The Mrs. Scott we meet in the flashbacks is all about duty and service. Duty to her mother and her son, service to her God. For her, life is something to be endured. The absence of any joy in her life has been shifted into condemning pleasure, dancing, music, romance. Her joylessness suffocates those nearest her, drives them away. It is easy to condemn other people when your beliefs are always right. Look at her relationship with Ian.
I love her. Of course I do. I'm her son. But she never let me breathe. Always watching me, deciding for me. Did she think I was going to run off to war? Be a boy soldier? She calls it protective. I call it interference. You can't associate with Donald MacLeod. He turned his back on the Lord. You can't go walking with that girl Elizabeth. She's been to Glasgow. You can't. What I couldn't do any longer was share a house. No, a country with her. I needed to breathe, to live my own life, to make my own mistakes. Canada offered freedom and opportunity for a young man.
Do we still feel sympathy for Mrs. Scott? She's turning into some sort of monster, isn't she? But don't forget the farewell scene, where Ian boards a ship called Hope. We feel for her, don't we? She's left empty. Crichton Smith's purpose in alternating scenes from the present with these poignant memories is to show how complicated the central character is. She has responsibility for the events of her past. This self-righteous, unemotional figure who accepts a life of service and duty is not the vulnerable character we see at the start of the novel. But the flashbacks are also about a growth to awareness, the search for truth.
Mar big mar sin, gyn sin sy gaif. A mi dol o gwlochag a ti gaif. Ar y mi mis, gymis eis yn hynny gyd.